All right, let's just jump right in. We tend to think of ancient holidays and biblical prophecy as, well, two totally separate things. But what if the key to unlocking one of the biggest prophecies was actually hidden deep inside a really old holiday? That's what we're going to dig into today. This idea that a specific holiday might actually be a detailed blueprint for the end of the world.
Yeah, I know, that's a pretty bold question, but the sources we're looking at today argue that the answer is a resounding yes. See, the whole idea here is that prophecy isn't just about what's going to happen, but that it's tied to a very specific when, a kind of divine appointment hidden right there in plain sight. So our starting point is actually a holiday you've probably heard of, Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. It's a time for celebration, thinking back on the year, looking ahead. It all sounds pretty familiar, right? But what's fascinating is that this familiar name, it's kind of masking a much deeper, much more ancient identity. See, here's the first big twist. In the Bible, this day isn't called the New Year at all. It's called Yom Teruah, and that translates to something like the Day of the Shout or the Day of Trumpets. Right away, that's our first major clue. It completely shifts the focus from just, a date on the calendar to a dramatic, loud, significant event. And it gets even more interesting because Day of Trumpets isn't its only other name. Not even close. Over time, tradition has given it a bunch of other titles, and each one, well, it peels back another layer of this prophetic puzzle. You should think of them less like simple nicknames and more like different camera angles, all focused on a single, massive future event. So the first of these names adds a really serious layer, Yom Hadin, which means the Day of Judgment. The tradition here is that on this exact day, God opens up the heavenly books to judge the deeds of every single person. So the main theme, cosmic accountability. Big stuff. Then it's also called Yom HaZikaron, the Day of Remembrance. Now this is key. It's not about us remembering our past. It's about God remembering His promises. Think about the covenant He made with Noah after the flood. That kind of world-altering promise. And the last name we'll look at brings in this whole theme of royalty. Yom HaKeseh, the Day of the Throne. This one points straight to the idea of a coronation, of God being recognized as the one true king over the entire world. Okay, so let's just step back and put this all together. You've got the blast of the trumpets, a day of judgment, God remembering His covenants, and the coronation of a king. These aren't just random themes for different holidays. They're all different facets of one single day. And together, they paint this incredible picture of a massive, world-changing prophetic event. So, we've got these incredible themes: judgment, remembrance, kingship. But how would someone living, say, 2,000 years ago have experienced this? Well, the argument is, they wouldn't just sit around and think about it, they would actually rehearse it. The ancient temple service for Yom Teruah wasn't just some dusty old ritual, it was basically a yearly dress rehearsal for the prophecy itself. And this service had a really specific structure, broken down into three main parts. First, you had the Malchiot, which were verses all about God's kingship. Then came the Sichronot, verses about remembering God's promises. And it all built up to the climax, the Shofarot, a whole series of trumpet blasts that ended with one final, great long blast. See how that lines up perfectly with the themes from the holiday's names? Kingship, remembrance, trumpets. It's all there. Okay, and this is where the whole thing connects to some of the most famous prophecies you've probably ever heard from the New Testament. The idea is that for centuries, we might have been reading these verses completely out of context because we've been missing this ancient blueprint from the Yom Teruah service. I mean, I'm pretty sure everyone knows this verse. It's talking about this incredible resurrection event that's going to happen at the last trumpet. And for a really long time, most people have just read that as, beautiful poetry, a powerful metaphor, but just a metaphor. But here's the absolute core question of this whole explainer. What if the last trumpet isn't a metaphor at all? What if the Apostle Paul wasn't just being poetic? What if he was using a specific, almost technical term? A term that his audience, who knew all about these temple services, would have instantly understood. And this is the aha moment. The last trumpet wasn't just a turn of phrase. It was literally the name given to the final climactic shofar blast of that shofarot section of the Yom Teruah service. So when Paul wrote that, he was making a direct, unmistakable link.
He was connecting the future resurrection of the dead to the climax of this very specific holiday. It wasn't random. It was an appointment.
And this pattern shows up again. It's not a one-off. Think about the book of Revelation, where John describes the scene of judgment, and he says, books were opened. Well, where have we heard that before? That imagery is a direct mirror of the theme of Yom Teruah, as Yom Hadin, the day of judgment, when the heavenly books are believed to be opened before God's throne.
So, what does this all mean? The fact that these massive, end-of-the-world type events seem so precisely connected to the themes and rituals of one specific day? Well, it points to a really powerful idea about how prophecy might actually work. See, the original Hebrew word for these biblical feasts is moedim. And that word doesn't just mean holidays or festivals. A much better translation is appointed times, or maybe even divine appointments. The idea is they weren't just set up to remember things that happened in the past. They were literally scheduled appointments with the future.
And that right there is the central takeaway. The argument is that these huge end-time events aren't just a random checklist of things that will happen someday. They're actually tethered to the biblical calendar, which would mean Yom Teruah isn't just a symbol of these events, it's their actual, scheduled, appointed time.
It's a pretty mind-blowing way to look at these ancient texts, right? And it leaves us with one last big question to think about. If the blueprint for something as huge as the resurrection and the final judgment was embedded in one of these appointed times, what other massive prophetic connections might we have missed just waiting to be discovered in the rest of the biblical calendar?